Hello future doctors, welcome to Anatomy Ki Duniya. I am Himanshu Bijlani doing MBBS from Jawaharlal Nehru Medical College Ajmer. So today we will start with a fresh view of the skull, that is the Norma Frontalis. So let's start. So now coming to the Norma Frontalis. So first I will read all the important lines of this paragraph, and then I will explain these lines in the 3D animation. So now let's start with the Norma Frontalis. The Norma Frontalis is roughly oval in outline, being wider above than below. It consists of various bones. The first one is the frontal bone, which forms the forehead. Its upper part is smooth and convex, but the lower part is irregular and is interrupted by the orbits and by the interior bony aperture of nose. The right and left maxilla form the upper jaw. The right and left nasal bones form the bridge of the nose. The zygomatic bones form the bony prominence of the superolateral part of the cheek. The mandible forms the lower jaw. The Norma Frontalis will be studied under the following heads, namely frontal region or biteal region, interior piriform shaped bony aperture of the nose, and the lower part of the face. So this is the Norma Frontalis, which is roughly oval in outline, being wider than below. It consists of frontal bone. This one is the frontal bone, which forms the forehead. Its upper part is smooth and convex, but the lower part is irregular. See, this one is the upper part of frontal bone, which is seen from the Norma Frontalis, and this one is the lower part. So the upper part is smooth and convex, but the lower part is irregular and is interrupted by the orbits and by the interior bony aperture of the nose. Now coming to the maxilla bone. So this one is the maxilla. This one is the left maxilla. Okay, so the second one is the maxilla, which are paired bone, which is a paired bone. Now coming to the mandible. See, this one is the mandible, which forms the lower jaw. Now coming to the zygomatic bone. This one is the zygomatic bone. This one is the zygomatic bone. So the zygomatic bone forms the bony prominence of the superolateral part of the cheek. See, this one is the lateral part of the cheek, and this one is superior. So it forms the superolateral part of the cheek. So from the zygomatic bone can be clearly visualized from the Norma lateralis. See, this one is the zygomatic bone, which is formed by the various processes of the temporal bone and the frontal bone. Now coming to the various region of the Norma Frontalis. So the first one is the orbital region. This one is the orbital region. Second one is the frontal region. This one is the frontal region. Third one is the interior piriform shaped bony aperture of the nose. This one is the interior piriform shaped bony aperture of the nose. And fourth one is the lower part of the face. This one is the lower part of the face. So now coming to the frontal region of the Norma Frontalis. So first point is the superciliary arch, which is a rounded curved elevation situated just above the medial part of each orbit. So see, this one is the superciliary arch, which meets at a point known as glabella, which will be discussed later. It overlies the frontal sinus and is better marked in males than in females. So what is the significance of this arch is that the eyebrows which are present superior to our orbit is present on the lower margin of this arch. Now coming to the second landmark, that is the glabella, which is a median elevation connecting the two superciliary arch. So this one is the glabella. And here is the meeting point of two superciliary arch which are coming medially at this point. Below the glabella, the skull recedes to the frontonasal suture to the root of the nose. See, this one is the frontonasal suture, and here is the point glabella. Now coming to the third point, that is the nasion, which is a median point at the root of the nose where the internasal suture meets with the frontonasal suture. See, this one is the frontonasal suture. See, this one is the internasal suture and this one is the frontonasal suture. So the point where these two sutures meet is the point known as nasion. So what is the significance of this point is that this point is used for the radiological and anthropological measurements. Now coming to the fourth point, that is the frontal tuber or the eminence. It is a low rounded elevation above the superciliary arch, one on each side. It is prominent in females and in children. See, this one is the frontal tuber. So what is the significance of this point is that they are the site of ossification of the frontal bone during the embryological development. Okay, so now coming to the orbital openings. So each orbital opening is quadrangular in shape and is bounded by the four margins. The supraorbital margin, which is formed by the frontal bone, at the junction of its lateral 2/3 and its medial 1/3, it presents the supraorbital notch. See, this one is the supraorbital notch, which is present at the junction of its lateral 2/3. This one is the lateral 2/3 and this one is the medial 1/3. And this one is the whole, this margin, the above, the superior margin is known as the supraorbital margin. This one is the supraorbital margin. Now coming to this infraorbital margin, which is formed by the zygomatic bone laterally and the maxilla medially. See, this one is the infraorbital margin, which is formed by the zygomatic bone laterally and maxilla bone medially. See, this one is the maxilla bone and this one is the zygomatic bone. Now the medial orbital margin is ill-defined. It is formed by the frontal bone above and by the lacrimal crest of the frontal process of maxilla below. So this one is the medial margin, medial orbital margin, which is formed by the frontal bone. This one is the frontal bone Then the frontal process of the maxilla. This one is the frontal process of maxilla. And by the lacrimal crest, which is present inside the orbit. See, this one is the lacrimal crest. Okay, so the medial orbital margin is formed by the three bones, namely the first one is the frontal bone, second one is the frontal process of maxilla bone, and third one is the lacrimal crest. Now coming to the lateral orbital margin, which is mostly formed by the frontal process of the zygomatic bone and is completed by the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. So the name indicates that first one is the frontal process of the zygomatic bone. So this one is the zygomatic bone, this one is zygomatic bone, and it has the frontal process. This one is frontal process, and this one is the frontal bone, which has the zygomatic process. This one is the zygomatic process. So the lateral margin is formed by the frontal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. So these two processes meet at the point known as the frontozygomatic suture. So this one is the frontozygomatic suture, where the frontal process of zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of frontal bone meets. Okay, so now coming to the anterior bony aperture of the nose. The anterior bony aperture of the nose is pear shaped. This one is the anterior bony aperture of the nose, which is pear or pyriform shape, being wider below and narrower above. See this one, it is wider below and narrower above. Now what are the boundaries of this aperture? Above, by the lower border of the nasal bone. See, this one is the nasal bone, which form the upper boundary of the this aperture. Now from below, by the nasal notch of the body of the maxilla on each side. So this one is the nasal notch. So on each side, the nasal notch of the body of the maxilla form the below boundary of this aperture. Now coming to the various features, the articulation of nasal bone anteriorly with the opposition bone at the internasal suture. This one is the internasal suture. Posteriorly by the frontal process of the maxilla. This one is the frontal process of maxilla. Superiorly with the frontal bone at the frontonasal suture. Superiorly by the frontal bone at the frontonasal suture. Inferiorly, the upper nasal cartilage is attached to it. So the features of the anterior bony aperture of the nose is that first one is the articulation of the nasal bone anteriorly with the opposite bone at the internasal suture, posteriorly with the frontal process of the maxilla, superiorly with the frontal bone at the frontonasal suture, inferiorly the upper nasal cartilage is attached to it. The anterior nasal spine is a sharp projection in the medial plane in the lower border of the pyriform aperture. Rhinion is the lowermost point of the internasal suture. Now coming to the clinical anatomy, the nasal bone is the one of the most commonly fractured bones of the face. Mandible and the parietal eminence are the next bones to be fractured. Okay, so let me explain all the features of the anterior bony aperture of nose. So first one was the anteriorly with the opposite bone at the internasal suture. So this one, these are the internasal bones. These are the nasal bones which meet at the internasal suture. This one is the anterior relationship Now posteriorly by the frontal process of maxilla, posteriorly by the frontal process of maxilla, this one is the frontal process of maxilla. So you can easily visualize this, that the nose is somewhat triangular in shape. So anteriorly there are the nasal at the internasal bones, so you can easily see that the bone is somewhat triangular in shape. Posteriorly by the frontal process of maxilla, superiorly by the frontal bone, and inferiorly by the upper nasal cartilage which is attached to it. Here the upper nasal cartilage is present. Now coming to the second point, which is the anterior nasal spine. It is a sharp projection. It is present here. This one is the anterior nasal spine, which is present here. It is present in the median plane of the nose, in the lower boundary of the pyriform aperture. So the third feature is that the rhinion is the lowermost point of the internasal suture. See, this one is the rhinion, which is the lowermost point of the internasal suture. So we have covered the frontal region, the orbital region, the anterior pyriform shaped bony aperture of the nose, and now we will start with the lower part of the face. So the lower part of the face consists of the maxilla bone, the zygomatic bone, the mandible bone. So first start with the maxilla bone. The maxilla contributes a large share in the formation of the facial skeleton. The anterior surface of the body of maxilla presents the nasal notch medially. See, this one is the nasal notch, which is present medially. The anterior nasal spine, which is the point of meeting of these two notches. This one is the anterior nasal spine. Let me remove this. This one is the anterior nasal spine. Infraorbital foramen 1 cm below the infraorbital margin. This one is the infraorbital foramen, from which the infraorbital nerve and vessels passes, which is present 1 cm below the infraorbital margin. The incisor fossa above the incisor teeth, and the canine fossa lateral to the canine eminence. The incisor, this one is the incisor fossa, and this one is the canine fossa. So in addition, there are four processes of the maxilla which are seen. First one is the frontal process of maxilla. This one is the frontal process of maxilla. Second one is the zygomatic process of maxilla, which meets the zygomatic bone. Third one is the alveolar process of the maxilla. See, this one is the hole. This hole is the alveolar process of maxilla, which form the alveolar socket or the upper jaw of the mouth. The fourth process, that is the palatine process, is not able to seen from this view. This can easily be seen from the Norma basalis. So let me show you. See, this one is the palatine process of the maxilla, which is easily can be seen from the Norma basalis. Now coming to the second bone, that is the zygomatic bone. See, this one is the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone forms the prominence of the cheek. The zygomaticofacial foramen is seen on its surface. See, this one is the zygomaticofacial foramen. This one is the zygomaticofacial foramen, from which the zygomaticofacial nerve and its branches passes. Now coming to the third bone, that is the mandible. So the mandible forms the lower jaw. The upper jaw was formed by the maxilla bone, while the lower jaw will be formed by the mandible bone. See, I will just go in brief about this bone. We will discuss the mandible bone in the later videos in detail because it is very important as for the viva point of view, and it is very important in examination also. So the upper border of the alveolar arch lodges the lower teeth. The lower border or the base is rounded. See, this one is the lower border, and this one is the upper border, which holds the uh, lower teeth. The middle point of the base is called the mental point. The middle point of the base is called the mental point or the nathion. See, this one is the middle point of the base, also known as the nathion. The point on the angle of mandible is known as the gonion. The interior surface of the body of the mandible presents the symphysis menti, the mental protuberance, and the mental tubercles anteriorly. See, this one is the symphysis menti. The mental protuberance somewhat here. Now coming to the mental foramen, which is present below the interval between the two premolar teeth, transmitting the mental nerve and vessels. See, this one is the mental foramen, which is the continuous of the submandibular foramen, which we will discuss later on in the video of the mandible video. Now there is the oblique line which runs upwards and backwards from the mental tubercle to the interior border of the ramus of the mandible. See, this one is the oblique line. Which runs upwards and backwards from the mental tubercle to the interior border of the ramus of the mandible. Okay, so now coming to the sutures of the Norma frontalis. So first one was the internasal suture. Let me mark all the sutures. This one was the internasal suture. Frontonasal suture. This one was the frontonasal suture. Nasomaxillary suture. This one was the nasomaxillary suture. Now third one was the lacrimomaxillary suture. This one was the lacrimomaxillary suture. Frontomaxillary suture. This one was the frontomaxillary suture. And intermaxillary suture. This one was the intermaxillary suture. Zygomaticomaxillary suture and zygomaticofrontal suture. This one was the zygomaticomaxillary suture and this one was the zygomaticofrontal suture. So these are all the sutures of the Norma frontalis. Now let us discuss all the structures which passes through the different foramina. Okay, so the structures passing through the foramina are the first one is the supraorbital notch or the foramen, transmits the supraorbital nerves and vessels. The external nasal nerve emerges between the nasal bone and the upper nasal cartilage. The infraorbital foramen transmits the infraorbital nerve and vessels. The zygomaticofacial foramen transmits the nerve of the same name and which is a branch of the maxillary nerve. So let's go through a quick recap of what we have studied in today's video. So we have studied the different bones of the Norma frontalis, that are the first one is the frontal bone. This one was the frontal bone. This one was the maxilla bone. This one was the zygomatic bone. This one was the mandible bone. And this one was the two nasal bones. Afterwards, we have studied the different regions of the Norma frontalis. First one was the frontal region. This one was the frontal region. So it consists of the superciliary arch. This one was the superciliary arch, which meets at a point known as the glabella. there was presence of the frontal tuber or eminence, which is a low rounded elevation which is present above the superciliary arch, somewhat here. Another important point was the nasion, which is a meeting point of the internasal suture and the frontonasal suture, somewhat here. Okay, then we go to the orbital opening. This one was the orbital opening. So this one was the superior orbital margin, this one was the inferior orbital margin, this one was the medial orbital margin, and this one was the lateral orbital margin. So the superior orbital margin consists and supraorbital notch, which is present at the junction of the medial 1/3 and the lateral 2/3. The infraorbital margin is formed by the zygomatic bone laterally, the maxilla bone medially. The medial margin was formed by the frontal bone above, the frontal process of maxilla bone, and the lacrimal crest. The lateral margin was formed by the two processes, namely the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. This one was the zygomatic process of the frontal bone and the frontal process of the zygomatic bone. This one was the frontal process of the zygomatic bone. So these two processes meet at a point known as the this one was the zygomatico-frontal suture. Now coming to the anterior bony aperture of the nose, it was formed by the lower border of the nasal bone and nasal notch of the body of the maxilla on each side. So afterwards we have discussed of the three bones that are present on the lower part of the face, that are the maxilla, the mandible, and the zygomatic bone. So in maxilla we have discussed of the nasal notch. This one was the nasal notch, which meet at a point known as the anterior nasal spine. The infraorbital foramen, the incisive fossa, the canine fossa, and the various processes of the maxilla bone. That are the first one is the frontal process, the zygomatic process, the alveolar process, and the palatine process, which can be seen from the Norma basalis. Coming to the next bone, that is the mandible bone. So in Norma frontalis, we can see the mental foramen, the symphysis mentae, the mentotubercle, the oblique line. In zygomatic bone, we see that we see the zygomaticofacial foramen, from which the zygomaticofacial nerves and vessels passes. Now we have seen the various sutures that are present on the Norma frontalis. First one was the internasal suture, the frontonasal suture, the nasomaxillary suture, the frontomaxillary suture, the lacrimomaxillary suture, the zygomaticomaxillary suture, the zygomaticofrontal suture, and the intermaxillary suture. Okay, so that's all for today. Hope you have visualized all the important foramens, the important sutures, and the important regions of the Norma frontalis. The attachments of the Norma frontalis will not be covered in this video because it will be very difficult for you to understand now. These attachments will be discussed later when I will teach you the facial muscles of the face. If you like my video, then do like, share and subscribe to my channel, and please share with all your friends. Thank you.